For many of us, wrestling figures bring us back to a time of youth. It returns us to a time where we'd wake up on the weekends and put together cards, title bouts, and rivalries for our micro federations. What those federations were comprised of depends on when we grew up. For some of us, it may have been the iconic Hasbro figures. For others, maybe it was Jakks and their many lines. For some now, it may just be Mattel and their all-encompassing rosters. But before all that, the foundation for what wrestling figures would be was laid. Long before the days of pinpoint accuracy, advanced articulation, and face scans was pro wrestling history, forever encapsulated in the form of action figures. Some represented all-time iconic names that still get modern figures to this very day, and others were names of that era that will likely never be made ever again. So get ready, and let's trek back as far as time takes us as we explore the origins, or the legacy, if you will, of wrestling figures. So, where did it all begin? What kicked off the hobby that so many of us hold near and dear to our hearts? Well, it depends on how liberal your standards are for what comprises of a wrestling figure. There exists a gorgeous George puppet believed to be from the 1950s that is likely the first toy to be produced in the name of wrestling. It's next to impossible to find, so unless you get lucky, consider it an unattainable holy grail. The first true line of wrestling action figures didn't come from the USA, it came from Japan all the way back in 1969, believe it or not. The figures were based on what was also the first Japanese pro wrestling promotion, Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance, aka JWA. The figures were made by Bullmark, a Japanese toy manufacturer famous for its vinyl figures of Godzilla and Ultraman. They included such names as Antonio Inoki, Giant Baba, Yoshimura Michiaki, and Seiji Sakaguchi. They came packaged in plastic bags with cardboard, though finding one still packaged is a big rarity. Related to these original figures, company Medicom has recently produced modern soft vinyl figures made in the spirit of the pioneering JWA figures. They stand at just under 10 inches, and if you have the desire to pay upwards of $100 to import them individually, the lineup they have is as rich as the price. They even have a licensing agreement with WWE, so Ultimate Warrior, Undertaker, Hollywood Hogan, Sting, and others are also available, in addition to some classic Japanese legends like Tiger Mask, JWA founder Riki Dozen, and even Bullmark reproductions of Inoki and Giant Baba, among others. But these are technically modern figures, so let's return to form and talk about the second known major line in wrestling figure history, Popeys. We don't have to travel very far for the next batch of wrestling figures. In 1981, Popey, a Japanese toy manufacturer that merged with Bandai, produced a set of foreign wrestling talent under the banner of Super Professional Wrestling. It's hard to believe given the absolutely iconic class of names in this series, but at one point this one-off series was based on modern talent. The 10 figures include rookie figures of some very important names in wrestling history. The set of 10 includes Abdullah the Butcher, Andre the Giant, Antonio Inoki, Bob Backlund, Dory Funk Jr., Harley Race, Hulk Hogan, Mil Mascaras, and Stan Hansen, along with Terry Funk. If you're looking for Hulk Hogan's rookie figure, take out a second mortgage and try to track down his Popey mint on card. Though, if we're being technical, there is a Hulk Hogan Naito statue that predates this figure, though it is just a statue and not a more traditional wrestling figure with articulation. I mainly just wanted to mention this statue because of this hilarious casual sketch of Hulk on the back. The Popey figures include a collectible trading card, and they have articulation in the arms and waist. While some do pop up loose online now and again, they're especially difficult to track down due to only being released in Japan in '81. not to mention the aforementioned high value in so many rookie figures. But now it's time to leave the East and return home, where we finally find the first line of WWF Wrestling Figures. WWF Wrestling Superstars by LJN is perhaps the first line of old school wrestling figures people may recognize on a wider scale. LJN took a bold move when they designed an entire line of wrestling figures made of solid rubber without articulation. The figures were closer to statues than actual action figures. The only action they had was when you accidentally stepped on them and gave yourself early arthritis. Wrestling Superstars came out at a time of great expansion for WWF, where Hulkamania was running wild and wrestling reached its status not as a pop culture pariah, but as a genuine pop culture phenomenon. The mid to late 80s will always be remembered for its vibrancy, and the likes of Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, and the Ultimate Warrior certainly fit the bill. What LJN Wrestling Superstars lacked in playability, they made up for in character. Every wrestler they produced had to be molded specifically for that superstar, meaning these figures were often a spitting image of whomever they were portraying. Generic is not a word you would use to describe LJN's WWF line, and that attribute has made them stand the test of time better than many other lines. Each figure came with a rolled-up poster featuring the iconic cartoon art style that fit the era so perfectly, though later on they replaced the stylized posters with real-life action shots. It should come as no surprise that intact posters have become just as collectible as the figures themselves. One of the greatest strengths of the line was the roster. You had the main event level talent you'd expect in guys like Hogan and Andre, but there was also spots dedicated to mid-card and managerial talent. You didn't just get Savage, you also got Miss Elizabeth, and bonus points if you find the rare pink-skirted one. Mr. Fuji, Classy Freddie Blassie, Captain Lou Albano, Bobby Heenan, Slick, a referee, and even Vince McMahon himself made an appearance in Wrestling Superstars. Mid-card talent like Adrian Adonis, Honky Tonk Man, Rick Rude, Coco Beware, and Bam Bam Bigelow filled out the cards of childhood federations worldwide. It didn't stop there, as there was also representation of tag teams like the Hart Foundation, Strike Force, the Killer Bees, and the British Bulldogs. 2-packs weren't released regularly, but they were another avenue of release during the hot late 80s period of pro wrestling. The line ended with a black-carded 89 series. This set is infamously difficult to get a hold of. The gist of it is that LJN closed its toy division in 1989, and a Canadian company called Grand Toys released the series with limited distribution. While it mostly had re-releases such as Hulk Hogan in white, Jake the Snake in green, and strangely a posthumous Adrian Adonis, it also included some very sought-after new figures, such as Andre with his WrestleMania 3 black singlet, Haku in Islander attire, and the Big Boss Man with Nightstick. But perhaps one of the most desirable was the Ultimate Warrior, his very first wrestling figure that came out during his rise to prominence. Through an issue of supply and demand, many never saw it during its day, and finding it on card is another endeavor to begin with. LJN's Wrestling Superstar line brought about many standards for wrestling figures, which is a bit ironic considering they were almost the anti-figure of wrestling figures. They produced one of the earliest wrestling rings called Fling 'em and Sling 'em, a ring you may be familiar with if you grew up a decade later during the Jax days with their Monster ring. There was also a line of thumb wrestlers, bendies, stretch figures, and other gimmick-based lines. LJN had a lot going on, but they weren't the only ones. The Rockin' Wrestling Saturday morning cartoon of the day had a set of erasers made by Winston Toys in 1985 that looked very similar to LJN's. Wrestling and erasers. Hey, it was the 80s. It's notable that there is an extremely rare figure of Wendy Richter that is, as of this video, the only figure of her ever made. But that was really all there was in the 80s in regards to wrestling figures? Immobile rubber statues and figures that helps you with your homework? No, in fact, running head-to-head with WWF's Wrestling Superstar line was competition coming from Verne Gagne and the AWA. They not only initiated the first interpromotional figure war, but they also brought cloth accessories and articulation in their arsenal. Running in near congruency with the LJN line, the AWA Remco line began in 1985. Judging them side by side with the LJNs, they look far older than they are. The body types are limited to just a few torso varieties, and the bodies emulate Mattel's He-Man Masters of the Universe style that came out much earlier. Much like the Wrestling Superstar line, being one of the pioneering wrestling figure lines, AWA All-Star Wrestlers hosted the rookie figures of many classic performers of the 70s and 80s. Ric Flair, Curt Hennig, the Road Warriors, they're all here for the first time ever. The AWA Remco line introduced cloth and accessories, two things that were mostly lacking from the LJN figures. Many of the initial figures also came with a souvenir related to the AWA, such as badges and stickers. The Road Warriors in particular had cloth pants and had a set of tag titles. Interestingly, 2-packs were the norm for the first few waves of the series. Flair and Sabisco, the Road Warriors, Baron von Raschke, and Rick Martel, among others, were put out in Wave 1. Wave 2 included more 2-packs in addition to some 3-packs. It's through this medium that the WWE Class of 2016 Hall of Fame trio of the Fabulous Freebirds is released, featuring Buddy Roberts, Michael Hayes, and Terry Bam Bam Gordy. Also in this second series is the Road Warriors with Paul Ellering, in addition to Steve Regal, not Steven Regal, and Jimmy Garvin, along with their manager Precious, the only female in the line, similarly to Toy Biz and LGN only having Miss Elizabeth as the sole representation of women. One more thing worth mentioning was the Fight to the Finish 2-pack, which included Steve Regal and Curt Hennig in addition to a VHS tape of AWA Wrestling. The third series of 2-packs was released under the banner Greatest Grudge Matches. Puerto Rican wrestling icon Carlos Cologne was included along with Abdullah the Butcher. Cologne has a notable variant where one singlet was red and the other was more of an orange. This is also the set that included Scott Hall's debut figure, complete with his suave 80s mustache. Remco, in vain, finally ditched the multi-packs and released singles figures in an attempt to boost slumping sales. The last series, much like the final LJN series, was produced in smaller numbers, making some of them incredibly valuable. These figures didn't show up in most stores outside of drugstores, largely due to the declining interest in AWA over the more popular WWF. The last set was titled Matt's Mania, and it included some re-releases as well as brand new figures. Among the re-releases were Nature Boy Ric Flair, a solo Paul Ellering, and the criminally underrated Nick Bockwinkel. Hopefully one day Bockwinkel will get the Mattel flashback treatment. Matt Mania also hosted the very first Shawn Michaels action figure, along with his tag partner Marty Jannetty. Getting him complete with those sunglasses is an expensive effort. But can you really put a price on the very first figure of Mr. WrestleMania? Speaking of ways to wreck your marriage, Chic and Nord the Barbarian are highly sought after as complete pieces. Nord came with many accessories, including an actual chain and fur vest with boot cuffs. Seeing as how this is already a difficult set to track down, keeping track of small, removable accessories makes it that much harder and that much more valuable. Remco also released a few rings for the AWA line. The ring was a combination of a canvas-like cloth material, cardboard, and actual wood. Finding one now with ropes that still have their elasticity is a challenge. The ring was sold in a variety of ways, by itself as a standalone ring, a red-themed ring that included a steel cage accessory, and most notably the Battle Royal ring. It included a whopping 7 figures along with a few roster variations that included some exclusive referees. One of the refs, Dick Whirl, was released solo later on, but interestingly the other 2 refs could be found in a 1982 series unrelated to pro wrestling. Remco's Lost World of the Warlords series had referee Nasty Ned with a reworked Mikola head, explaining his Wolfman-like appearance, and the other exclusive referee Curly Brown had a reworked Michasti head. Looks like Jack's BCA-era Jeff Jarrett using Owen Hart's head wasn't the first recycling in the world of wrestling figures. The Remco line lasted under 2 years, and not many years after that, the tenured AWA itself also went under.
Here we go!
After Remco and Wrestling Superstars, our timeline hits 1990, and with it comes the WWF Hasbro and WCW Galoob era. But the 1990s seems like a good place to stop our trip through time and reflect upon how much wrestling figures have evolved over the years. Beginning in Japan during the end of the 1960s with the JWA line, picking off with the Japanese Popeys over a decade later, and then hitting the wrestling boom of the 1980s with the WWF LJN and AWA Remco line, wrestling figures certainly have history, and they are most definitely here to stay.